Hello, this is Hazardice Building, and welcome back to my dirty desk. And welcome back to my continuing efforts to improve my hobby skills by trying to create my own custom Imperial Guard Regiment for Warhammer 40,000. Which means attempting to find a way to make every available unit as unique as they can be. As you can see by the video thumbnail, I decided to spruce up my Ogryns by turning them into Sasquatch Ogryns. Why? Well, the next box that came up in my pile of shame was a box of Ogryns, the few abhumans still usable in Imperial Guard armies, which got me thinking about how to put them into the Americana theme I was going for, and the answer came to me almost immediately. Sasquatch, aka Bigfoot, the missing link between man and ape. A figure whose many believers still insist it totally exists, and sightings are still being reported to this day. And you should buy some Bigfoot merch to help their search. Anyway, the point is that I thought that such a hulking creature would be a good base to mix with the other hulking creatures known as Ogryn. Once the regular models are put together, the biggest difference in looks is obviously the fur, and there are a couple of different ways to go about it, depending on how you want said fur to look. No matter how you do it, you're going to need a large amount of green stuff to mold. As always, put some water on your hands and or tools before touching any green stuff, or it just sticks to everything. The first method, if you want the model to have, like, long, shaggy fur, is to cut off a small piece of green stuff, then roll it so that it's thicker on one end and thinner on the other, almost like a teardrop shape, and apply it to the area where you want the fur. Then, with a thin sculpting tool, toothpick, or whatever you got on hand that's small enough, press in some indentations to help give it texture. Keep in mind that if you do things this way, you'll have an easier time putting the strands together going from the bottom up of whatever you're attaching the fur to. Depending on the look you're going for, I personally think it's also a decent way to add hair to a character. I mean, look at this guy's flowing locks. The second method, which I ended up using a lot more because it was faster for me, is just taking a bunch of green stuff and wrapping it around anything that wasn't armor. Then used a thin sculpting tool to once again add texture. The difference between the two methods is that this one makes the fur look much shorter overall. Now, I could have just ended things there and that would have been good enough, but I wanted to do a bit more to help them stand out on the battlefield. And the best way to do that would be to give them unique weapons. For one that was not that unique of a weapon, I took a blade from the sprue and glued it to the Grenadier gauntlet, giving it a bayonet attachment. For the power moles, I simply wanted to give them something similar but more primitive, with more spikes, like an old caveman club. The first attempt of this did not go great. I tried using very small amounts of green stuff to fashion into the spikes, but my efforts to mold them correctly, and even just keeping them on the maul, were in vain. I'm sure someone more experienced could have made it work, but I couldn't. Instead, I used the other two unused blades from the sprue to put on top of the maul. Then I cut up the sprues themselves at various angles for the rest of my jagged spikes. I think overall it turned out a lot better than using green stuff. However, it did leave gaps in places where the spikes were attached and didn't look like it was, a part of the weapon. So I cut some more green stuff into thin, long lines and wrapped it around the spikes to make it look as if they were fashioned into the weapon with leather straps. I think these two relatively simple methods make my Ogryns stand out just a little bit more than the others. And now it was time to paint them. As usual, I used the Army Painter's gray primer to, prime them. As for the fur, I used hardened leather, zealot yellow, and blood red speed paints, because I almost never get to use speed paints and I wanted to try it. With the gray primer as a base, it gave them all a slightly different shade of brown, which wasn't what I was expecting, but I think it works out. Just enough to tell them apart. For the spiky clubs, I wanted them to look like they were fashioned out of a large predator. The idea for what little lore they have is that they come from a death world, similar to Catachan, but more of a giant forest than a jungle. As a rite of passage for these Ogryns, they hunt down the massive monsters that prowl the planet's surface, using the fangs and bones of such great beasts for their clubs. To achieve that look, I used another speed paint, Pallid Bone, but to me it didn't quite look bony enough. So I used the same trick I used on these Chaos Space Marines that I started and then completely forgot about. The nice thing about these speed paints is that they'll reactivate after they're dry with a bit of water. So I waited for the palette bone to dry, then reapplied some water, taking away just enough paint till I got the shade I was happy with. I also used hardened leather again for the leather straps. If you've watched my other videos, you'll be familiar with the red, white, and blue color scheme I used for the rest of the model. Elven armor for any armor, and gemstone for any symbols and trim on the armor. Matte white and pure red for the stripes on the shield, which I also covered in a bit of fairy dust to make it look more metallic. Then some barbarian flesh with a flesh wash for what little skin was exposed. And all these paints come from the Army Painter brand. I also wanted to incorporate a star onto the shield, but I wasn't happy with trying to freehand it. It didn't look great, as you could see for yourself. I decided to be a bit lazy, and bought just a bunch of little wooden stars I could just glue onto it. After filing them down to a good size and painting them white, they fit on rather nicely. Then I covered everything in a strong tone wash. After, I tried my hand at some edge highlighting and even tried painting the eyes. It didn't go well, but at least I can say it didn't ruin the model. As for the bases, I put on some Vallejo mud and grass texture paint, and then some grass tufts to cover up some mistakes I made around their feet. Hey, if no one can see it, no one can tell that one of them is missing half their foot. And now I present my Sasquatch Ogryn. Do you like them? Do you hate them? Was there something I could or should have done differently? Have you ever put your own spin on the various abhumans of the 40k universe? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget the usual YouTube thing of giving a thumbs up if you liked the video or a thumbs down if you didn't. But if you did like it, then subscribe to see more Hazardice building. And I hope to see you in the next video.